one. So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule, and I know many of you have been in the classroom all day, and so we welcome you to taking time after the busy day to be with us. My name is Julie Duffield, and it was a great pleasure. I welcome you to today's webinar, Social Emotional Learning and Literacy in Science. This is part of a series on discipline literacy that the Secondary Literacy Partnership is doing in collaboration with the Strategic Literacy Initiative, and we'll show you and tell you a little bit more about that. So the secondary literacy is being in operation since 1990, I think. That's a long time, and it's been sponsored to highlight professional learning and the importance of literacy for adolescents at the secondary level. So you can see the partners that we have: the Association of the California School of Administrators, California County Superintendent's Educational Services, the California Department of Education, the California Teachers Association, and I'm joining as part of the California Comprehensive Center that is a part of WestEd. So it's a true partnership, and our mission, you can see, is really empowering students to read, write, and speak across lots of disciplinaries as lifelong learners. We're excited about this series because we're doing it in collaboration with the Strategic Literacy Initiative and the Reading Apprenticeship at WestEd. And we are doing a series, as we said. We did one in September looking at the lens of literacy through leadership. This one today is looking at discipline literacy through social emotional learning, and then we have one in April on evidence-based argumentation. And as part of this series, we will be archiving the webinars, and we also are going to be launching an extension activity in Collaborate in Common, which is one of the new platforms for collaboration sponsored by the California Department of Education. So we'll share more on that. So without further ado, Cindy, I would like to introduce Cindy Greenleaf, who's the co-director of the Strategic Literacy Initiative, SLI, here at WestEd. And Cindy, would you like to introduce Abby?
Sure, I'll take it. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us. We've been carrying out research and development and working with teachers for nearly 25 years now on the project of building students' advanced literacy skills, and our framework, Reading Apprenticeship, focuses not only on literacy skills and strategies, but on those dispositions for learning that are key to adolescents' needs as learners. So I'm pleased to be sharing some of what we've learned with you today. And over our history, we've worked with many science teachers, so I'm especially pleased to have Abby Nochi co-present today's webinar. Abby's been teaching for over 20 years herself, is a science teacher and literacy coach in New Haven Unified School District, and as a skilled reading apprenticeship teacher, she's a facilitator for our Reading Apprenticeship Professional Learning. I'm really delighted to have her with me and hope you find her wisdom about teaching students and working with teachers as compelling as I do.
Cindy, would you like me to just do over the housekeeping? Thank you, Cindy. So
sure.
I just want to remind just to whoever arrived, you can read more about Cindy in the chat. We will be asking you to do quick writes, write the comments in the chat on the right, and we'll have some polls. And we really will pause to take your questions and comments, and we'll have some guided discussion. Really encourage the chat to be where you can share with one another. Delphine, can you post in the audio? Some people are asking about that. If you just joined us, remember, here's the phone numbers where you can call us in. And I want to ask you to type in the chat if you already haven't done so, and give us a little bit information about yourself. We're going to quickly throw out a poll, and it will show up in the bottom right-hand side of your screen. So if you could tell us a little bit about, just to see who's on the call, and you'll see a panel on the bottom right-hand side of your screen, and we'll give you about 30 seconds to select one. And if it's none of the above, please type in the chat. So if you don't find the poll, feel free to type in the chat just to get to see who's on the call with us today. So I'm looking at the chat, Abby and Cindy. I see that a lot of folks are teachers. Others are describing themselves as college instructors. And then we have some school administrators and coaches. And thank you.
Any science teachers with us today?
If you're a science teacher, please type it into the chat. If you cover science mostly, that would be fantastic.
Super.
And we would like to do a quick poll here. We would ask you how familiar are you with the Reading Apprenticeship? If you could hit the green check if you're familiar with the Reading Apprenticeship, that would be great on the bottom right-hand side of the screen. And then if you could type in the chat if you're a high school, if you're doing work with science. So if you could now type in and let us know how familiar you're with the Reading Apprentice, or type it in the chat. So Cindy, looking quickly at the chat, there are 1 or 2 people. I've said Christina said she's familiar. Jennifer has said, and Kelly. So we have a few people who have heard of and familiar with reading science, but most have said not yet. So I will hand it over to you to share about that and give you the ball.
Great. So I will give you a little bit more information about both the Strategic Literacy Initiative and our program of work to set this webinar in the context of who we are and what we do. Over our project history, we've developed and continue to refine an apprenticeship approach to literacy instruction across the disciplines that we call reading apprenticeships. So that's where that name comes from. We've designed and tested inquiry-oriented models of professional learning for teachers and many tools to support teacher learning and implementation. We conduct also ongoing studies to refine and improve the impact of these models and approaches. We think of this as kind of engineering research, working with educators across the subject areas and grade levels to fashion real solutions to the literacy ceiling, limiting our students and our nation, and testing to see how well these solutions are working, and then cycling back to refine and improve them. Do I have the ball? It's not moving forward. Let's see. Can you move the ball move the slide for me? It's not working on my keyboard. Sorry, Julie.
No worries. Just next slide, and there we are.
Terrific. Okay, because Reading Apprenticeship has shown positive impacts in changing teaching practices as well as improving student learning outcomes, we've received multiple Investing in Innovations grants and seed grants from the Office of Innovation and Improvement. We were also part of the Department of Education's Reading for Understanding initiative, where we led the science work. We're listed on the Evidence for ESSA website, and the Collaborative for Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning has designated Reading Apprenticeship as a select program, the highest level of quality in their CASEL guide for secondary. Next slide. So through these grants, we estimate by now we've been able to reach over 5,000 teachers, more than 2 million students since 2010. We've been developing layers of support for sustained implementation of Reading Apprenticeship, teacher leadership, state coordinators and administrators, and helping to link Reading Apprenticeship to other reforms underway in participating states and districts. We work with communities of educators to improve the literacy engagement and achievement of students both online and in face-to-face settings, and we provide site-based professional development across the country and even internationally, as you see. Next slide. I mentioned that several studies have shown profound shifts in instruction for teachers who received Reading Apprenticeship professional development compared to control groups. But important for today's presentation, the impacts have often been greatest in secondary science classrooms. As a result, students in these classrooms have advanced more than a year ahead of their peers in reading. When their teachers, only one teacher even, implements Reading Apprenticeship routines in their subject area classes. So let me get to the agenda for today. Next slide. What we hope to do is share the connections between the Common Core state standards or Common Core aligned standards and important learning dispositions that we need to foster in our often resigned or reluctant adolescent learners. We want to share the Reading Apprenticeship Framework, and in particular the role of what we call metacognitive conversation, big phrase, in building students' learning dispositions and literacy engagement. We'll share a video from a classroom to give us a concrete example to think and talk about. And finally, we'll come back to the impact we've seen on teachers and students. Throughout the webinar, we'll hear from Abby about her implementation and experiences. So to advance students' academic and high-level literacy proficiencies, we need to really increase the rigor. And over the history that we've been working on this, calls for academic rigorous learning opportunities for students have become more and more urgent. Next slide. In our group, Strategic Literacy, we argue that we can't wait to offer subject area literacy instruction until students have gained the basics. We've seen instead that helping students to learn to read science and history and literary materials well can really make a vital contribution in advancing their literacy skills and their learning. So we see this rigor as a way to actually support students to grow. We're on to the next section. The Common Core standards and aligned standards recognize that the literacy practices of the disciplines differ and that students must be taught how to read and write and reason in each subject area. Pardon me. As the slide says, each discipline has its own specialized ways of reading, writing, speaking, reasoning, and distinct forms of expression. And each discipline practices particular reasoning processes that determine what counts as a good question, as evidence, and so forth. Students really don't come to our schools already knowing these things. They need to be taught, right? In science in particular, texts take many forms: diagrams, models, graphs, and complex arguments and expositions. All of these, like the molecular model on the slide, pose challenges of comprehension to the learner. And for students to do well in science courses as they move up the curriculum, they need to learn to make sense of these various kinds of texts. So I'm going to go very quickly to remind you about the Common Core literacy standards and what they're asking for. Students who are college and career ready. Next slide. Really fast. And in attaining that college and career readiness, wide and deep reading, close reading of increasingly complex academic text is serving a very important role. Next slide. Students are expected to gain an understanding of the particularities of disciplinary texts, norms and conventions of these texts, domain-specific language, precise details, as well as to be able to follow and make sophisticated evidence-based arguments. Next slide. So the connection to science is a really nice one in that the Common Core standards are paralleled by these next generation science standards. In the next generation science standards, students are expected to learn science by engaging in scientific practices. Here are the inquiry practices of science. Did you lose me?
Yeah, I lost you a little bit. Thank you.
Okay. Here are the inquiry practices from the next generation science standards. And I guess a question to the group, just think about this. Which of these inquiry practices demand literacy skills? Think about reading, writing, reasoning, and talking, discussing. We would argue that all of these practices entail literacy. Next slide will show you that this is paralleled as well by new standards for the social studies and history. where an inquiry arc for social studies focuses on the nature of inquiry in particular, and how students actually engage in inquiry to communicate their conclusions after evaluating sources and using evidence. All of these things are asking for very high-level literacy proficiencies. So next slide. Very ambitious, but to reach these sorts of goals, we need to recognize that our students are not where we need them to be. Pardon me.
Cindy does this. We'd like to hear, do you recognize the student? If you could let us know by hitting the green check button, if this resonates for you. So Cindy, just looking through the call, Michelle said yes, it resonates for her. Thank you. Kelsey, John. Thank you. So Cindy, I'll keep moving.
Right. We like this phrase, inexperienced and unprepared, rather than incapable. Let's hold on to that as we move forward. What about this form of teaching? Is this familiar to you? Just give us a check if so.
If you don't see the poll screen, just type in yes or no instead in the chat. So looking at this one.
Also seeing some resonances. Even though we've been working on implementing the Common Core around the nation, educators often feel unprepared themselves to turn the intellectual work over to students. We see this in PowerPoint slides and lectures, pardon me, kind of like I'm doing now, giving students explanations and interpreting text for them. And this isn't malicious. A large part of the reason why this happens is that teachers are worried about their students' reading proficiencies, and they want them to engage with the content. So next slide. We'd like to give you a chance to write about some of the challenges you face in supporting the new standards across the curriculum, particularly if you're working in science, if that's an area you've been working. But broadly, what are the challenges that you're facing?
We'll give folks about a minute. We'll stay quiet while you do that. Thank you. Cindy, you see, we're just on a minute here. Thanks, everyone, for sharing.
Okay, I'm having difficulty seeing the chat room.
So let me read it out.
Pardon me.
Just have students, getting students to articulate their reasoning. As you stated, teachers are doing the heavy lifting and not allowing the students to be self-directed and involved in their learning. Students utilizing the understanding the terms within the scientific text. Here's a few of the sharing.
Yeah, that all sounds so familiar to me. Let me turn it over to Abby to talk with you about her school district and her teaching.
Hi, everyone. I'm Abby Noche. And as
Abby, could you talk up a little bit?
Sure.
I'm just a little louder. Thank you.
That's better?
A little louder.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right. Hi, everyone. I'm Abby Noche. And as Cindy mentioned earlier, I've been teaching for over 20 years. It's actually 26 years to be exact. And so I only started with Reading Apprenticeship probably about 6 years ago, and so I have some pretty good, I guess, anecdotal stories of what my classes look like before Reading Apprenticeship and then after. As you can see where the arrow is, we're smack dab in the middle of the Bay Area. And our town is kind of small with only about 75,000 people, and we have a single high school, which is the largest in Northern California, with approximately 4,000 students. About 48% of us are on free and reduced lunch, so by no means are we a wealthy district. And according to our demographics, we have about 17 ethnic groups, so there's a lot of diversity at my school. Well, so, you know, in my first 20 years teaching, where I wasn't doing Reading Apprenticeship, I was noticing a lot of the same difficulties that people have echoed in the chat. It's stuff where the students really were having trouble gaining meaning from reading. And so if they struggled with the academic vocabulary, they couldn't figure out the processes being described. They often ignored pieces of the text, thinking that that's not really text, such as diagrams and process diagrams and labeling. And so I noticed a lot of the same struggles that you all have echoed. And I remember that, you know, I thought, I'm not really an English teacher, so how do I even teach reading? And because I felt ill-equipped to do that, I pretty much just told. And I would tell the kids what they should know. Well, so interestingly, one of my students, it's been several years since I've had him. I'm going to name him Chris. When he left my high school, graduated and moved on to college, he was super excited to talk about, like, I want to major in physiology, which is the class that I had him for. And he was, like, he couldn't talk enough about how much he loved physiology. He was so excited to go off to college and take all these physiology classes. But when he visited me about a year after he graduated, he told me he changed his major to econ. And I thought, wow, that's a huge shift. How come? And he says, Ms. Noche, I realize I really love taking physio with you, but without you, it's really hard. And I know that Chris meant to be complimentary about his experience in my room, but I took that as a, wow, what did I not do? Was I doing so much for him that I didn't really help him to learn how to do that on his own? And I was really left with the questions, how do I develop a student's internal capacity? Well, ironically, a little bit after that, there was a new teacher who was asked to participate in a training called Reading Apprenticeship. And she was in her second year with us. And so she was, when we were giving our common exams, the year before when she had no Reading Apprenticeship, she was scoring on par with everybody else. But after 1 year of these monthly optional trainings, just 1 hour after school, her scores went up on the common exams by 10%. In fact, our whole biology department, we were so intrigued by the changes she was seeing that our whole biology department decided to follow suit and get trained a year later. After that, the scores on the statewide exam went up by 10%. So with all of these great stories, the whole school followed, and now we train all teachers that are new to our district. So that's what we're doing to meet this challenge. So right now here, how Abby and her school are tackling the challenges, you guys will see there's a norms poster. So while I mentioned that our teacher who was learning these Reading Apprenticeship routines, it's one thing to learn all of these routines. It's another thing to create the environment that is conducive to that, to the work. So at the beginning of every school year, I ask, what conditions do we need to maximize our work together? So what conditions do we need to maximize our work together? I have the kids brainstorm those on their own, and then they get a little bit of time to share that with a partner or a small group. And then I collect them. I collect them because I want to see what the individuals as well as what the groups had said. And when you're doing this across like all of the classes you teach, it would be kind of crazy to put a norms poster up with like 30 norms on it. So when I was reading through what they had written, maintaining their student voice, I was putting it into a Google Doc that everybody could see. once I did that, I could see that there were certain categories that these norms fit into. So the list that you're looking at is the categories of the norms that the kids came up with. So in our Google Classroom, it's a standing document where their voice is preserved, but then the categories are what you see before you, and it's those categories that I wrote on a poster that is visible to our students at all times. I feel like when we articulate, I feel like when we articulate what we need in our classrooms, it sets the stage for all the other work that needs to happen. And so you'll see, looking at those norms, you'll see that there's safety to think, to try, and to be wrong. And there's also room to, once we have all that thinking out there, let's create collective goals around the work and our ideas. So all this norms poster is really kind of setting the stage for how we want to get our work done.
Thanks, Abby.
Great. Go ahead.
I think we just want to brainstorm, I think, what norm might be helpful for you as a professional learner. We thought we would share some of that. And if you have any questions, Cindy, that have come up in the chat, or Ruth, please feel free to mention those now as we pause.
You may be wondering about this focus on norms. We will try to make the connection to social emotional learning in just a moment.
I have to say the one that I really like as a norm is the risk-taking one as a professional learner. You know, taking risks. So. Are there any other questions, Ruth or Cindy, that you see that you'd like to address now? I think making the link with how this sticks with social emotional learning it's unfolding. But any other questions or comments, Abby, before we move on?
I'm trying to address some of the questions in the chat area, so I'll hold off on speaking more.
Okay. If you see any that you'd like to address over the phone, let us know. Otherwise, we can keep moving here. So thank you. And Cindy, I think
I really like the focus on risk-taking, and I want to underscore that all learning requires taking risks, right? We know that to advance students' literacy development, this is the kind of work they should be doing, unlike what we saw with the passive teaching, which is still routine in schools. Grappling and inquiring, raising questions, making meaning themselves, building knowledge, identifying and solving problems, using evidence, and constructing and critiquing argument. Well, we often think of knowledge and strategies and skills when we think of what students need to attain that kind of proficiency or to gain those sorts of habits. Let's go to the next slide. And here's the connection with the social emotional. What about these learning dispositions? What role do these play in literacy development? Resilience, grit, and determination. Having a growth orientation so that I know that I can keep at something and get better. How about stamina for long, complex texts so that I can pace myself or regulate myself, my awareness, my mental awareness of the text if I'm straying away from it in my mind as I'm reading. Having persistence and agency, feeling a sense of self-efficacy. All of these things are social emotional skills, sometimes called non-cognitive factors involved in student achievement. Psychologists used to believe that these were relatively fixed attributes of personality, and many students and teachers still believe this. But what's interesting about the reemergence of interest in these dispositions is that understood now to be changeable with instruction. Next slide. Here are some of the non-cognitive factors that matter. Building a student's sense of resilience, building their repertoire of learning strategies, helping them to understand that effort and not ability, right, not traits that are assigned to them at birth, make the difference in learning. So that's the mindset. Research has shown that cultivating these kinds of competencies improves student success more than focusing on skill building alone. So we're going to have some visions here today about what it might look like to do both at the same time, because what's interesting is while some of your schools may be using these or supporting social emotional learning in counseling or guidance sessions or in after-school programs and so forth, or in some kind of behavioral programming for kids in terms of discipline, in fact, infusing these social emotional learning dispositional skills in teaching practices every day, all the time, to create a learning environment that's supportive of social emotional learning is really powerful, and that's one thing that's rare. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. Next slide. Here's some research from not only the work of Dweck and her colleagues, which you may be familiar with, but a psychologist, Walsh, who works on developing resilience in families that are undergoing crisis. And these researchers offer some guidance that can be usefully translated, we think, into the classroom. If we create an environment in the class where it's normal to struggle, everybody's confused by text, where we can make our understandings visible to others, the implicit, explicit, and where we can persist and solve problems and work together collaboratively, and where teachers focus on effort rather than intelligence, when they're focused on the process of learning rather than the products alone. All of these things help students really persist and dig in. So I wonder if you want to take a minute to respond. Is this a learning environment that you see in the subject areas in your sites?
Thanks, Cindy, and you can either click on the check or elaborate in the chat. Thank you. We'd really like to hear how you're seeing this come up in the schools and districts you support and work in. Thanks, Corey. Corey shared it comes in some places, but not all of them. Thanks for. So of the people on the chat, 3 have said yes, and 1 has said no, not yet.
Mm-hmm. Great. Shall we move on?
Yes, we do. And Janet just said some teachers embracing this approach have other teachers fear the lack of solid evidence for grades holds them back. Interesting.
Sometimes it's hard to know how to grade progress, too. That's a difficulty. Well, this is a chapter that, the name of a chapter that my colleague Ruth, who's on the chat room today, and I wrote called Fostering Engaged Academic Literacy for Adolescents in the Handbook of Adolescent Literacy Research. And we're arguing in that chapter that students need to develop these dispositions that we've talked about in order to take kind of a code-breaking stance when they're faced with difficult text and faced with comprehension problems. Let's move on. Next slide. That students need to build academic dispositions while they're engaged with worthwhile literacy tasks, and that fosters a kind of intellectual engagement while they work together with others to make meaning of complex texts. And when they come to view literacy as an inquiry to where they're empowered to gain knowledge and to build knowledge. Next slide. So very quickly, I want to introduce you to the Reading Apprenticeship Framework. And I know that there's a lot to understand in this diagram right here. It's a complex text. But some of the things I want to point you to are the social and personal dimensions of the learning environment, and not simply the cognitive and the knowledge building dimension. So we often in literacy across the content areas focus on teaching students cognitive strategies or helping them understand specific language or how texts are structured. But we think starting in a different place, particularly with adolescents, is key. And that is to make visible how we're thinking and how we're working on things together, to validate and take up confusion as the starting point for learning. We're going to move on to the next slide. I want to just make the connection with you. This metacognitive conversation we're going to come back to in a minute, so if it's muddy for you now, hopefully we'll clear it up. But these are the 5 CASEL competencies: self-awareness, self-management, social awareness, relationship skills, and responsible decision-making. And when you look at the social dimension and the personal dimension, what occurs to you about a crosswalk here between these two ideas, the CASEL competencies and these social and personal dimensions of the classroom? And maybe some of the cognitive too. Anybody making connections between those ideas?
I think if you could give us an example, someone asked.
I'm going to give you more than an example. I'm going to show you a video in just a moment. But let's first click forward.
Susan says making meaning jumps out at her.
Uh-huh.
Meaning making, I mean.
Well, some of the connections I might make here are between self-awareness and monitoring comprehension, right? Between social awareness and being able to work in a community of students collaboratively making meaning of text, right? So some of those connections are just about the learning environment that you're setting as a teacher. Let's move forward, though, and take a look at the role of metacognitive conversation in this. Oh, are we going to take a moment here, Julie?
I think we've done that, Cindy. In light of time, I think we should just move on. Okay?
Right, that's what I was thinking. So if you move forward, think about the varied science representations that I mentioned. So faced with a complex diagram, maybe, that shows intricate processes at work, what does a novice science reader do? They skip it. It seems like a colorful but completely mystifying display, right? Faced with complex language and sentence structures of science exposition, the same novice may skim the text. But what students really need to do to learn from science is to dig in. So some of the ways that we help students dig in is we turn the tables on what counts in the classroom. We don't ask a comprehension testing question. We ask students, what was confusing? That's confusing. What was confusing here? And we can make confusion the starting point for learning. And we can ask other students, what did you figure out? How did you figure out that problem? Can you show us? So that we become a community of learners that are engaged in problem solving. Some of these metacognitive conversation routines will be highly familiar to you. Think aloud with teacher modeling and partner think alouds. Annotation, which we call talking to the text, which has a slightly different meaning, as you'll see. Reciprocal modeling, where problem solving strategies are being shared in the class community, and this collaboration to make meaning. So those should be pretty familiar routines. We're going to look at a classroom next where Cindy Ryan is working with a group of struggling readers identified for extra support. If you could go to the next slide, Julie. In a reading apprenticeship academic literacy class, students were reading up to 5 years below grade level, and they had this year-long course helping them to build engagement and dispositions and skills. Let's move on. The kids we're reading, next slide.
I just gave the ball to Del. Del, can you move the ball, please?
The kids were, that we're going to watch them read this particular text, so I wanted to just give you a minute to glance at it and maybe think about the kinds of challenges students might face. So that's probably enough just to have a taste of the text.
We'll go into the video protocol now, Cindy, is that right?
Yes.
So as you watch this,
yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say to folks, as you watch this video, you can type into chat, and Cindy, you can share some of the questions that you want. And if you have any problems, let us know, and we'll post the URL into the chat so you can watch it elsewhere. So it's coming up now. Cindy, is there anything that you want to say to folks about the questions that they will look at as they do this? I'm not seeing the video yet.
Sure. Keep an eye on how the teacher is engaging the students and making their thinking visible and sharing what's confusing and working together to solve confusion.
Okay, so Delphine, the video's not showing. Can you put it up, or we'll just ask folks to go to YouTube? You need to jump in and let us know.
I don't know why the video is not working, but I did post the video, the YouTube link.
So folks, we're going to Plan B. If you could click on the YouTube video in your chat area, I will show it on the screen. If you could click on that and then hit the green check when you finish watching it. And Delphine, in the meanwhile, can you work out what may go wrong? So we're just going to repost a chat in the YouTube video. Here it is. It's coming up. It's just loading slowly. So we'll play it, and I'll ask Cindy and everyone to mute their phones.
Wondering what's simple. Remember, with Think Aloud, we can ask questions, right? What's simple? Is it the comic book? Or read?
Abby, can you mute your phone, please?
Volunteers to do another chunk from here down.
So, Cindy, I think we're finished that.
Right. Can we go to the next slide? I just want to ask folks to muse a little bit about what you noticed. What stood out for you here?
So, Kelsey Rice, she prompted students to elaborate through encouragement and not spoon feeding. And John wrote, the teacher took time breaking down the meaning and small sentences, asking for multiple students for their interpretations. Or he said, I love that the teacher listened to other students' answers and encouraged students.
Right. Taking all responses, listening respectfully, prompting for elaboration, really trying to get at their thinking and not doing the thinking for them, right? So let's move on and give the mic back to Abby to talk about her work in her classroom.
And Christine said she asked for evidence from text, and Carla said all students felt safe in verbalizing their point of view. So, right. Abby, back to you. Thank you, everyone, for sharing.
All right. Well, as I mentioned earlier, the norms set the stage, but part of setting the stage is the everything else. So we have some pictures from my classroom. Sorry, I don't have any pictures of students in my room, but, you know, there's that whole confidentiality thing. Anyway, so let's go ahead and drill down on the kinds of things that I'm talking about when I say set the stage. So go ahead, next slide. So this is a picture of my classroom. You'll notice that all the desks are in groups of 4, and it allows the kids to have either a small group conversation or a pairs conversation. They have someone at their shoulder, and they also have someone at their face. You'll see that there's also textbooks in the middle of the group of 4 desks because I want that to be readily available. Usually when I'm asking about somebody to, asking for someone to reference things in text, the kids will be really helpful. They call out page numbers when they find it. Everybody references the same thing. We're all reading the same passages. So the text right there is super helpful. You'll notice around the room, they look like white pieces of paper lining cabinets along the wall. Those are my word walls. And the word walls are just all that academic vocabulary is just there. I don't want kids to be struggling with the word. I want them to have the words at their fingertips, but then now we're going to use that language. I also have, I don't have it visible here, but I have dry erase boards that are about 2 feet by 3 feet. And those dry erase boards allow kids to kind of outline their own thinking in a group of 4, and then that can be visible for others. And let's see. Oh, and then along the back wall, you'll see, let's see, there's a thing that kind of looks like a shower curtain, but it's just to the right and left of the shower curtain. And if we could advance to the next slide, you can see more closely what I'm talking about. So this is where I allow the kids to chart the thinking. And whenever we're reading through something, they're identifying the places that they're confused, and then they're putting them up on this board. And so you can see questions like, what is the final electron acceptor? Sorry that it's not as legible as I'd like it to be. How can you tell when a substance is going to be reduced or oxidized? What happens to the H's at the end of cellular respiration? So the kids are asking these questions, and we just leave them there. Like, I'm not trying to answer them. I don't validate with like, hey, that's a great question, as opposed to some other question that isn't. All of it gets to be up there. All their voices are represented. And then as we continue with our learning, we will revisit the questions that are there to see if we have arrived at any conclusions, any answers. any evidence, and then they can go back into their text to find that evidence. So that's the charting the thinking. Go ahead, next slide. Also in the middle of the group of 4 desks is a workbox. Go ahead to the student supply. There you go. Oh, one back. On the student supply box, there's just all these kind of hodgepodge of items that will help the kids kind of make their thinking more visible. So you'll see there's colored pencils, perhaps if they want to color diagrams that I'm providing. There's Post-it so they can keep track of their questions. There's highlighters so that they can annotate their own note-taking and thinking. They don't get to annotate textbooks. That's still kind of don't touch the textbook. But at least if they want to keep track of their thinking, there's Post-its in order to do that. You'll see that there's an eraser, and underneath that are 2 small dry erase boards. Those are about the size of a piece of paper, and it allows a pair of kids to outline their thinking with each other. And then, you know, they can sort of hide their boards from the partnership that is across from them, and then they can share when I need them to. So there's dry erase pens and erasers and all of that to support it. You'll also see that there is a piece of paper. It's a little, yeah, there you go. Whoever is doing the reading, writing, thinking, talking, and questioning. And then there's it's a brochure where it's kind of divided into 3s. And so that's a little crib sheet for a bigger version that is on our next slide. So go ahead to our next slide. So I live by a quote that I heard from in a reading apprenticeship training, which was, those who do the reading, thinking, and talking, you'll see that across the top, are the ones who are also doing the learning, and you'll see that at the bottom. So remember the brochure that we were looking at earlier in the student kits? It was divided into 3. Well, so you'll see that when I talk about, like, okay, I'm reading, here's all these things in this column that when we read, this is what this means in our class. When we're doing our thinking, this is what this means. When we're talking, etc. So that the kids, this operates sort of as our big crib sheet. Now, I didn't generate that just like I have all these great ideas, let me just share with you all these great ideas. At the beginning of the year, I led the kids through different experiences around our text. And every time we finished with something, then I go, okay, so what did we do here that helped you understand this a little bit better? And I basically charted all of their thinking on various small boards around the room. And so when I had all of this evidence of, like, these are the things we're going to do when things get hard. When we're talking, this is what talking looks like, et cetera. When we're thinking, this is what our thinking would look like. So I consolidated all of that and then put it on the shower curtain. And so now it lives as sort of an artifact that we use, you know, when I can easily say, okay, you guys, in your conversation today, please make sure that you're focusing on our solar norms. Or in your conversations today, remember that confusion is cool, right? And I can just cite the place on our shower curtain, please make sure you're observing this in your conversation. So that's what setting the stage looks like in my classroom.
Thanks, Abby. We just have a pause here. I think, you know, a picture paints 1,000 words. Thank you for sharing that. And just folks on the call, any questions, reflections, or comments? I know it's been a long day, but if you have anything that pops out or resonates or you try yourself or have some elaboration. Good question. So might the shower curtain brochure look different each year? Is the question, Christina.
It might. Usually the sentiments are all there, but the language, because I do want to honor student voices, that's what would make it different. I find that when I first started reading apprenticeship, my shower curtain looked really kind of puny. And there wasn't a lot of text on it because I myself wasn't really sure how I wanted things to look. And so you know, as the years have gone by, now we have a whole lot of things we can just serve as our anchors. And so my shower curtain has progressively gotten longer. So.
Cindy, do you want to reflect with Abby any comments that you see as she's on what she just shared as some more questions come in?
Well, I really love the comment that Abby made about honoring student voices. And it brings me back to, it's cool to be confused. Confusion is the starting place for learning. Students are doing the work. Students are thinking and talking, right? And all those wonderful devices that Abby shared about how she supports that for her class.
And someone said, could I show the shower curtain again? And Corey says, the idea of this type of modification anchor chart to share experience. I like that. And Corey says, do you add to the chart throughout the year? Question.
Usually I add to the norms. Yeah, usually I add to the norms only because, like, now I've run out of room. I suppose what I should do is have another rack. We can add to it some more, except it would be at floor level. So I think I would need to continue onto maybe the dry erase boards that are around that shower curtain. That is sort of the easiest housekeeping thing that I can think of for that.
Lots of reading apprenticeship teachers actually create posters for different texts the first time that students are going to meet up with a particular type of text to sort of keep track of what's different about reading this text, what new tools do we need. So this can vary, and we call these things living reading strategies lists, talking strategies lists, right? Let's move on to the next slide. And this is this wonderful proverb, right? We know that collaboration is not only key to the 21st century learning skills students need, but it's actually the way to get some progress, right? And so you see all of the ways that Abby is supporting her students to collaborate. Let's turn to the evidence we have that working this, do we want to stop a moment? I think this is key, actually. Let's stop here for a moment. Think about the social emotional learning dispositions that I was talking about earlier, the metacognitive conversation and all these ways that Abby is supporting her students to make thinking visible, and make some connections there. Right. I love that, Jana. Thank you. They're interconnected. You can't really do one without the other. That's why our framework starts with that social and personal dimension, setting the context for this kind of work, helping students take risks to be learners. Well, maybe we can move on to the last remarks. I do want to share the next slide, which is about this kind of shift we've been talking about, this deep shift, this deep instructional change from teachers doing the work to students doing the work, and what we have to do to support that. Our primary work in strategic literacy is about professional development. We help teachers move their instruction toward the kind of classroom you heard about from Abby and saw in the video. And we do that by engaging teachers in experiencing the very instructional approaches they will implement in the classroom, practicing that metacognitive conversation routines with texts that are hard for them as adult learners. And they learn then how to engage their own students. I'm going to blur through a couple of slides about the impact because I did talk about this before. If you'll just click to the next slide. We've done lots of studies and we've got lots of impact data. Next slide. But the thing that I want to really focus on is what a difference this turning the tables on what counts in the classroom makes for students. So if we can go to the next slide. Here's just a student voice. One of our students in one of our studies said, when I first started this class, I was scared. I've discovered that I have the courage to read stuff that I couldn't read. I'm more confident. I also need to work on spelling. So I think what's so revealing there is that it takes courage to read. That's just something that blows my mind, right? It takes courage. Learning requires risk. And there's one more student voice that I wanted to share with you. My reader identity is getting a lot more knowledge into it, and that makes me feel like I'm a smart young man who can do whatever I set my mind to, and whatever people say will not hurt me because I know how I have the knowledge to school them. So this moving kids forward through social emotional learning integrated with literacy development can be life-changing. And I'll turn it back to Abby to say a few words about what she's seen.
So at my school, we started Reading Apprenticeship a little bit before we dove deep into Common Core and the next generation science standards. And as those have unfolded for our site, we realized that Reading Apprenticeship goes hand in hand. You know, new teachers, they have standards to follow too, like creating an effective environment and engaging students. Again, Reading Apprenticeship goes hand in hand with that. Currently, our school focus is meaningful interaction, and that comes from the English Language Learners Standards, and that also, Reading Apprenticeship goes hand in hand with that. So I realized that, like, even though Reading Apprenticeship I took on because I wanted to really maximize what my students could do as opposed to me always being the teller of everything, but I realized that every professional group that I'm in, it impacts us too. If we observe, like, norms, how do we want to get this work done together? And our work is reading the standards and negotiating what that means for us, and then developing curriculum around it, and then providing those experiences for kids. So that's how it affects teachers. For students, I have to tell you about a student of mine. Her name was Monica, and it was probably the very beginning of October, and I swear I didn't hear her voice for about the first month of school. You saw that my classroom is in groups of 4, but every time I would, like, walk by, she would just get really quiet. And I wasn't even sure if she was talking in the first place. But one day after a long fire alarm, and it was like, it wasn't a drill, so there was no notification that we were going to have this, and then we ended up being outside for about 45 minutes. Monica absolutely talked my ear off. She told me how she transferred from a different district and was now in our district, and that explained to me maybe that's why she wasn't really talking, because she was new to everybody while everybody else had sort of grown up together. But it was after that conversation that this very quiet girl just gained a lot of self-esteem, and she was now eager to discuss, like, everything. She was eager to say what she was confused about. She was eager to say, this is how I think I understand it. What do you guys think? She was really, like, I thought, so brave to share anything of what she's thinking, because as Cindy mentioned, that's a risk, and it was a risk that she was willing to take. Well, the following year, she was still at our high school, and this time her hardest class, she said, was physics. And when I asked her, well, okay, so physics is hard, what are you going to do about it? She said, I'm going to keep track of my questions as I read. I'm going to pose those questions to my group and pose them to my teacher. I'm going to try and explain things when I can, and if I can't explain things, I'm going to listen really hard when somebody else is explaining something. Oh my gosh, I just thought, wow, she's like a poster child for Reading Apprenticeship. I followed up with her physics teacher just to go, hey, how's Monica doing? And the physics teacher said, wow, Monica is one of my strongest students. And it was noteworthy to the other teacher that how brave Monica was, how much she facilitates her group, how much she adds to classroom discussions. And, you know, like from a girl who really didn't say anything to a girl that's really taking charge of her learning, I think that's what it means for kids.
Wow, Abby. Very inspiring. Thank you, Abby. As we're just drawing an end here, we have about 6 minutes left, so I just want to share for folks, as we end off here today, we can ourselves go deeper, because today we were doing an overview, and in a short webinar we surfaced and looked at, you know, disciplinary science through the lens of the science classroom, and we'd like to now invite you to a new extension activity that we'll have to continue the conversation. So after this webinar, you are invited to attend a sort of guided discussion, looking at a video of a classroom and going for a deeper dive in the new Collaborate in Common. So we would love you to help us and join these going beyond the webinars and the new Collaboration in Common. It will give a deeper dive, and we'll look at the social learning again and sharing and learning from one another as we do this piece. The extension activity that will happen in Collaborate in Common will, as we say, do a deeper dive into looking at a video and then a piece of text on social and personal dimension learning that comes from the chapter of, is it the Leading by Learning? Cindy, what is the your chapter? You have this on your website, correct?
This is from Reading for Understanding.
Thank you, from Reading from Understanding. And I want to guide you back to that webinar that we did around that called Leading for Literacy. You can find more there. So we invite you in. We'll put the link that you can sign up directly. I'm not sure if you know about the Collaborate in Common space. It's a platform that is sponsored by the California Department of Education. You'll find lots of collections for teachers to share resources and learn with and from one another. And we're really fortunate. I don't know whether you want to mute your phone, to have a strategic literacy coach with us who will be facilitating that session. So Heather, do you want to say a few words?
Yeah, I hope everyone can join us. I'm looking forward to digging into this classroom video case and also some more text around reading apprenticeship and social emotional learning. So please join us.
Thank you. The Strategic Literacy Partnership will facilitate another webinar on April the 25th, so we invite you to attend that. So as we're ending off here, we'll be shared, the feedback form is in the chat. And for those of you who want the information about today's webinar, all of the artifacts, the handouts, the PDF of the presentation, and the archive will be posted into the box folder. So as we end off here, I just wanted to thank you and also point you to where you can get to learn a lot more about the Strategic Literacy Initiative as well and the Reading Apprenticeship work. So here are some links, and you can look at those when you get and download the handout. We have a channel of past webinars that the Secondary Literacy Partnership has sponsored there. And as I said, we are doing something new with Collaborate in Common, which is asynchronously, which allows you to have discussions after the webinar. So we want to thank you so much for attending today's webinar. We really encourage you, please, to hit on the link. We'll post it again into the chat where you can register to go into the extension activity. We'll be also invite you to look at the previous webinars and give us your feedback and invite you to come to the next webinar. So as we're ending off here, Cindy and Abby, I really want to thank you for your presentation today, and Cindy for doing it under the weather and not just being able to be present for this presentation, and Abby, after a day in your classroom, thank you for sharing what you're doing. So Cindy has also posted some links in the chat. Any final questions? Cindy and Abby, I'll let you have the last word here as we end off today's presentation.
I hope this has been useful to you in thinking about how social emotional learning dispositions can be supported even while literacy skills are being built, even while knowledge is being built in the disciplines. And I wanted to point out that at readingapprenticeship.org, you see the link right there on that former slide, you can find lots of resources for teaching, downloadable resources that are connected to our book. You can also find videos, so hopefully you'll find that a good resource as you go forward.
Thank you. And Abby? Just
yeah. So I wanted to share how much it's really transformed my teaching. And I remember when I first started, I felt like, oh my gosh, there's a lot of, I guess, control that I'm giving up. And I'm not really sure what's happening in their conversations. I'm not really sure what they're learning. And all of those things, once you actually see kids doing the work, it'll make you wonder, like, why wasn't I doing this sooner? And so I'm thankful that I started doing it later in my career, because now I feel like I have the tools that I didn't have in my first 20 years of teaching.
Wow. Well, thank you. And thank you, everyone, for taking time. And again, Cindy and Abby for doing this. And we invite you back. And thank you all for being here after a busy day in the field yourself. And please give us your feedback. And we look forward to you being part of the new extension activities and coming to the next part of the series. So thank you, everyone, and thank you for the great work you're all doing out there. Really appreciate the difference you're making. So thank you all. We're officially ending today's webinar, and we hope to keep in contact with you. So thanks, everyone. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Cindy, get that on.
Yeah, I hope so.
Bye.
All righty. Bye-bye.